Imagine, just for a moment, that you are the absolute giant of the intellectual world. I don't mean you have a bestseller or, a popular TED Talk. I mean you are the Colossus.
Right. The guy.
The guy. You are selling books by the millions, and I mean literally over 1 million copies during your lifetime.
Which is a number that, for the 19th century, for a philosophical writer, it's just staggering.
It doesn't compute. You're being toasted by the elite in London's private clubs. Your ideas are sparking actual political movements in places as far away as China, Japan.
And the greatest writers of the age are using your ideas. Tolstoy, George Eliot. They're weaving your theories right into their characters.
You are, for all intents and purposes, the Aristotle of the Victorian age.
It's a level of fame that's really hard for us to grasp today. I mean, maybe the closest comparison would be if you took Einstein's scientific credibility and mixed it with the pop culture reach of a Jordan Peterson or a Yuval Noah Harari.
Yeah, but even that doesn't quite get there, does it?
No, because it wasn't just a niche. He was the air the Victorians breathed. His ideas were everywhere.
Exactly. But then, you fast forward a few decades, not even a century, and you've almost completely vanished.
Poof, gone.
You go from being the greatest philosopher of the age to a punchline. People stop reading you. Academics scoff at your work.
And the one single phrase that everyone still knows you for,
The one sentence that defines your entire legacy.
is almost universally attributed to somebody else.
It's a spectacular fall from grace.
A complete collapse of reputation. And I'm guessing we're talking about the great Mandela effect of the history of science here.
We are indeed. We're talking about the phrase survival of the fittest.
Yes.
If you walked out on the street right now and asked 100 people who coined that phrase, what would they say?
99, maybe 100 of them would say Charles Darwin.
Of course. It's synonymous with Darwinism. But they'd all be wrong.
Completely wrong. It wasn't Darwin at all.
It was the man we are doing a deep dive on today, Herbert Spencer.
That's the classic cocktail party fact, isn't it? The one that always gets a little bit of a surprised reaction.
There really is.
Darwin didn't use that phrase at all in the first edition of The Origin of Species. It was Spencer who read Darwin, sort of nodded along, and then said, I have a catchier, more philosophical way to describe this whole natural selection thing.
And Darwin actually liked it.
He did. He ended up adopting Spencer's phrase in the later editions of Origin, specifically the 5th edition. He thought it captured the mechanism of natural selection really well, even though it opened the door to a lot of misinterpretation. But yeah, the words themselves, they belong to Spencer.
So today, our mission is something of an archaeological dig. We're going to excavate Herbert Spencer from the dustbin of history. And I want to be really clear to you listening. We're not necessarily here to praise him. When we get into the weeds of his social theories, there is some genuinely dark, controversial stuff.
Oh, excellent.
Views on race, on poverty, on the elimination of the unfit, stuff that can be quite shocking to modern ears. But we need to understand him, because he's the missing link in understanding the 19th century.
And not just the 19th century. To understand the political arguments we are having right now today about the size of government, about the welfare state, individual liberty, you have to grapple with Spencer.
He's the ghost in the machine.
He is. He's in many ways the intellectual grandfather of modern libertarianism. He was formulating arguments for the right to ignore the state long, long before the modern movement ever took shape.
So we have a massive stack of source material to get through today. We're drawing from his biography, his huge multi-volume system of synthetic philosophy.
Which is a title in itself.
It is. And we're looking at the critiques from his contemporaries and the historians who later, dismantled his reputation. We're going to look at his theory of everything, his complicated feud/friendship with Darwin, and the huge paradox of man who championed survival of the fittest, but was personally a pacifist who absolutely hated war.
It's a fascinating story.
But let's start at the beginning. Who was this guy? Where does a mind like this even come from?
Well, Herbert Spencer was born in Derby, England in 1820. And if you want to understand why he spent his whole life fighting against authority, you just have to look at his dad.
Okay.
He was the son of William George Spencer, who was known as a religious dissenter.
I saw that term dissenter pop up a lot in the notes.
Yeah.
For those of us who might not be up on our 19th century British religious history, that's not just a generic term for a rebel, right? It carries some specific weight.
It does, yeah. In this context, dissenters were Protestants who separated from the Church of England. They were the nonconformists.
So outside the establishment.
Completely outside. They were often barred from certain public offices or from attending universities like Oxford and Cambridge. So there was this built-in culture of being an outsider, of questioning the established order.
And his dad was deep in that world.
Very deep. He drifted from Methodism to Quakerism, but the core trait he seems to have passed down to Herbert was this staunch, almost pathological opposition to all forms of authority. He ran a school based on very progressive teaching methods, but interestingly, Herbert himself didn't really go to school in the traditional sense.
He was the ultimate autodidact. That really stood out to me.
Oh, completely.
He didn't have a university degree. He didn't come up through the Eton and Oxford pipeline like almost every other British intellectual of that era.
No, he was totally outside that system.
Yeah.
He was taught primarily by his father and his uncle, the Reverend Thomas Spencer, and his education was, well, it was highly curated, let's say.
What do you mean by that?
He learned mathematics and physics because the subjects interested him. They fit his view of a mechanical universe. He learned enough Latin to translate some easy texts, but he famously refused to learn things that bored him. He just wouldn't do it.
So he was kind of a picky eater, but for knowledge.
That's a great way to put it. He acquired his knowledge through what the biography calls narrowly focused readings.
Narrowly focused readings. That sounds like a very polite way of saying, I only read what confirms my existing biases.
There is certainly an element of that. He was famous later in life for not reading books that disagreed with him. He'd read the first few pages, get annoyed, and throw the book across the room.
Wow.
But in his youth, he really was a sponge for information, just not through the lecture hall. He learned through conversation. He'd hang out with smart people, with scientists and radicals, and just absorb their ideas.
It feels very modern, doesn't it? Like he was learning via the 19th century equivalent of podcasts and YouTube essays, rather than sitting in a classroom.
It does. But because he wasn't part of that academic machine, he had this really unique career path. He wasn't a professor. He couldn't be.
He started out as a civil engineer.
Right. During the railway boom, you have to picture the late 1830s in England. It was like the dot-com boom of the 1990s. Everyone was building railways. It was the future.
And Spencer was right in the middle of it.
He was. He worked as a civil engineer, drafting plans, looking at mechanics, dealing with bridges and gradients. And I think this is absolutely crucial to understanding him.
How so?
It gave him a mechanical view of the world. He saw the world as a system of forces, pressures, balances, and equilibriums. He didn't see society through the lens of poetry or ancient history. He saw it as an engine, something to be understood and optimized.
And speaking of optimizing things,
Yeah.
we have to talk about the invention. This is my absolute favorite detail in the entire biography.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Somewhere between writing about the fundamental laws of the cosmos and inventing the field of sociology, Herbert Spencer invented a precursor to the paperclip.
He did. He called it a binding pin. It was distributed by a company called Ackerman and Company.
What did it look like? Was it like the paperclips we use today?
Not quite. If you look at the diagrams, and he actually included drawings of it in his autobiography, which tells you something.
He was proud of it.
Very proud. It looks more like what we would call a cotter pin today. It was a piece of metal used to hold sheets of paper together. It just shows you how his mind worked on every level. He couldn't stand disorder. Loose papers were incoherent homogeneity, if you will.
Uh-huh. Right. A chaotic blob of paper.
And he needed to bind them into a system. He wanted to optimize everything, from the universe down to his desktop.
But, and here's the great irony, for a guy who was trying to optimize binding paper and optimize society, he seemed to have a really, really hard time optimizing his own life.
Oh, that's putting it mildly.
The sources describe him as a lifelong hypochondriac.
The hypochondria is absolutely central to his character. After about 1855, he suffered from some kind of nervous breakdown that, by all accounts, he never really recovered from.
What were the symptoms?
He was constantly complaining of pains, of insomnia, of digestive issues, of all these maladies that no physician could ever actually diagnose. He essentially became an invalid for the last half of his life.
The phrase nervous sensibility comes up a lot. It wasn't just that he was in physical pain, it was that he couldn't handle stimulation.
Exactly. He couldn't handle excitement. He couldn't handle disagreement. He had to dictate his books because the physical act of writing taxed him too much.
I read he would take a rowboat out into the middle of the Serpentine Lake in London just to get away from the noise.
He did. He wore earmuffs. He was incredibly sensitive. And there's a famous story where he canceled a meeting with his friend T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, a very intense, argumentative guy.
Right.
Spencer canceled because he feared that if they got into a scientific disagreement, the excitement would ruin his night's sleep. He literally couldn't handle a debate with a friend.
I just have to pause on that for a second because it's so relatable on one level, but it's also so deeply contradictory.
How so?
You have this man who is famous for a philosophy that is often described as ruthless, survival of the fittest, let the weak fail, a philosophy of iron and struggle.
The epitome of a hard philosophy.
And yet, a heated chat about biology sends him to bed with a migraine.
Eh.
He is this incredibly fragile vessel carrying a very, very hard philosophy.
It's a striking contradiction, and some biographers have suggested that his philosophy was almost a way of managing his own internal chaos.
A coping mechanism.
In a way, yes. If he could prove that the universe was orderly, that there was a law for everything, that everything was progressing toward a perfect equilibrium, maybe the chaos of his own nervous system would feel less threatening.
That makes a lot of sense. But despite the nerves, the ambition was just boundless. He didn't just want to write about biology or politics. He wanted to explain everything.
Everything. And this is where we get to the synthetic philosophy.
That word synthetic is important here. He doesn't mean fake, like synthetic fabric.
No, not at all. He means synthesis, as in bringing it all together into one coherent system. He published a prospectus, basically a business plan for his life's work.
What did it say?
It essentially said, I am going to write a series of books, 12 volumes, that will demonstrate a single universal law that applies to the formation of the stars, the cooling of the earth, the evolution of biological life, the development of the human mind, and the structure of human societies.
That is a staggering amount of confidence. I mean, most scientists spend their whole lives studying one species of beetle.
And Spencer wanted to explain the entire cosmos, from the nebula to the nation-state.
So what was this law? What is the secret to the universe, according to Herbert Spencer?
At its core, it's the law of evolution. But we have to be very, very careful here because he isn't using the word evolution in exactly the same way a modern biologist would.
It's broader for him.
Much broader. For Spencer, evolution was a cosmic process. He defined it as the universal movement from simple, undifferentiated homogeneity to complex, differentiated heterogeneity.
Okay, that is a mouthful of Victorian academic speak.
It is.
Simple, undifferentiated homogeneity to complex, differentiated heterogeneity. Let's break that down for the listener. What are we actually visualizing here?
The easiest way to think of it is the movement from a blob to a machine, or a blob to a body.
Okay, a blob to a body. I like that.
The universe, in his view, starts as a nebula, a giant, diffuse cloud of gas. Every part of that cloud is basically the same as every other part. That is homogeneity. It's simple.
It's a blob.
It's a blob. But then gravity starts to act on it. It pulls it together. It starts to spin, clumps form, and eventually you get planets, a sun, moons. Now you have a solar system. You have distinct parts, a sun, an earth, a moon. They're all different. They're specialized. That is heterogeneity.
And he believed this single process applied to absolutely everything.
Everything. Take a biological embryo. It starts as a cluster of identical cells. That's homogeneity.
A little blob of cells?
Exactly. And it grows into a baby with a brain, a heart, a liver, and skin. All these specialized organs working together. That's heterogeneity.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or take a primitive tribe, in Spencer's view. Everyone is doing more or less the same thing. Hunting, gathering. Simple, homogeneous. But a modern industrial society has bankers, bakers, engineers, artists, podcasters.
Right, millions of specialized roles. Complex, heterogeneous.
That's it. For Spencer, that movement from simple same to complex, different, is the arrow of time. It's the fundamental law of all progress.
So he thought this was a law of physics, basically, like
Yeah.
gravity or thermodynamics.
Yes, he saw it as a physical necessity. And this is where the comfort comes in for his Victorian audience. You have to remember, the mid-19th century was a time of massive anxiety.
A crisis of faith.
A huge one. Geology was showing the Earth was millions of years old, not 6,000. Darwin had just shown up and suggested we were related to apes. God was, for many educated people, retreating from the picture.
And that leaves a void, a terrifying void. People were scared that life was just random, meaningless chaos.
Precisely. And in walks Herbert Spencer with these massive, dense books, and he says, don't worry, there is a plan. It's not a divine plan in the old sense, but it is a natural plan. The universe is not chaotic. It is moving from chaos to order. We are evolving toward perfection.
That word perfection is key. He really believed there was an endpoint, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He was what philosophers call teleological, which means he believed processes have a goal or a purpose. He believed that evolution wasn't just random change, it was progress. It was directional.
And where was it all heading?
To a state of perfect equilibrium, the perfect man in the perfect society. And he combined the scientific-sounding framework with a kind of residual religious feeling. He was an agnostic. In fact, he coined the term the unknowable to describe the ultimate reality or power behind the universe.
The unknowable.
Right. He argued that this was the one thing that both science and religion could agree on, that the ultimate cause is inscrutable. We can study phenomena, but we can never know the thing in itself.
But he didn't treat this unknowable force as neutral or scary.
No, not at all. He treated it as benevolent. He wrote that the laws of nature were the decrees of a being transcendently kind. So he basically smuggled a deist god back in through the side door.
So the message is, if you just get out of the way and let the laws of nature do their work, everything will eventually become perfect.
Exactly. And that is why he sold 1 million books. He allowed Victorians to feel scientific without becoming nihilistic. He gave them a new faith, a secular religion of progress.
But this faith in progress brings us to the most contentious part of his work, his biology and his relationship with Darwin.
The Great Showdown.
We established that Spencer was writing about evolution before Darwin. He wrote an essay called The Philosophy of Style in 1852, and another one, Progress, Its Law and Cause, in 1857. Darwin doesn't publish The Origin of Species until 1859.
Right. So Spencer was already an evolutionist. He already believed species weren't fixed, that they changed over time, but he had a different mechanism in mind for how they changed.
So when Darwin published, what was Spencer's reaction?
He felt vindicated. He was like, see? I told you species changed. This famous biologist just proved my point. But he never fully abandoned his original belief in Lamarckism. He just sort of bolted Darwin's idea onto his existing system.
Lamarckism. We need to unpack this because it is the absolute linchpin of his entire political and social worldview. This is the idea of use inheritance, right?
Yes. It's named after the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The classic textbook example is the giraffe.
Right, the giraffe stretching its neck.
Lamarck argued that a giraffe stretches its neck to reach the high leaves on a tree. That effort, over its lifetime, stretches the neck just a tiny bit. Then, the crucial part is that the giraffe passes that acquired longer neck down to its offspring.
So the baby giraffe is born with a slightly longer neck because of its parents' efforts.
Exactly. Generation after generation of stretching and passing it on, and you get the modern giraffe. Spencer believed this applied to everything, especially human psychology and morality.
So if I work really hard my whole life to become disciplined and punctual and moral, my children will be born with a biological predisposition to be disciplined, punctual, and moral.
That's exactly what he believed. And conversely, if you are lazy or criminal or aggressive, you pass those acquired character traits down to your children. Your choices get written into your biological hardware.
And how is that different from Darwin's idea?
Darwin's big idea was natural selection. For Darwin, it's about random variation. In any population of proto-giraffes, some are just randomly born with slightly longer necks than others.
Just the luck of the draw.
The luck of the draw. And in an environment where the lower leaves have all been eaten, the ones with the slightly longer necks can eat, survive, and have more babies. The short-necked ones starve and die out. The environment selects the winners. It's a filter, not a striving mechanism.
So it's passive in a way.
It is. Spencer accepted natural selection as part of the process. He's the one who called it survival of the fittest, after all. But he always thought the main driver of human progress was this Lamarckian self-improvement being stamped into our genes.
This distinction, Lamarck versus Darwin, it seems technical, but it actually explains his entire view of the poor in social policy, doesn't it?
It explains everything, absolutely everything. Because if Lamarck is true, then suffering has a purpose. It has a pedagogical purpose.
It's a lesson.
It's a lesson that gets passed on. The struggle to survive forces you to adapt, to become smarter, stronger, more disciplined. And those improvements then get hardwired into the human race.
So if you take away the struggle,
If you take away the struggle, if you give people free food or free housing or a safety net, you aren't just making them lazy in the short term. In Spencer's view, you are committing a crime against the future. You are stopping the biological evolution of the entire species.
You're preventing the adaptation that leads to the perfect man.
You're halting progress itself.
Wow, that is a heavy concept. It turns welfare from a kindness into a sin against cosmic law.
That is exactly how he saw it, and it's the bridge from his biology to his sociology.
Right. So let's talk about the sociology. He viewed society as a social organism. And from the sounds of it, he took this metaphor very, very literally.
Incredibly literally. He wasn't just saying society is like an organism. He was saying it is an organism, just on a different scale. He spent pages and pages in his books mapping out the analogies.
Give me some examples.
Okay, so he said the government is the cerebrum, the brain's nervous system, because it regulates action across the whole body.
Makes sense.
The roads, railways, and telegraphs are the vascular system, the veins and arteries, because they distribute nutrition and information.
Okay.
And the working class, the producers, they are the alimentary system, the digestive tract, because they process the raw resources for the benefit of the whole organism.
It sounds a bit like a freshman biology student trying to force a metaphor, but he built his entire worldview on it.
He did. And within this organic view of history, he saw two main types of society competing with each other. This is probably his most enduring contribution to sociology. The militant versus industrial distinction.
Militant versus industrial. Let's break those down. What is a militant society?
A militant society is the primitive form. Think of Sparta or the Roman Empire or feudal Europe. The primary goal of the whole society is preservation against external enemies. It's organized for warfare.
So it's structured like an army.
Exactly. It's hierarchical. Your status is everything. You do what you are told. The individual exists to serve the state, not the other way around. And cooperation is compulsory. You work because if you don't, you get whipped or imprisoned or killed.
And the industrial society, that's the evolved form.
That's the evolved form. And he doesn't just mean a society with factories and smokestacks. He means a society based on production rather than destruction. In an industrial society, the primary social bond isn't status, it's contract.
A voluntary agreement.
A voluntary agreement. I will do this for you if you do this for me. People cooperate because it's in their mutual self-interest. In this type of society, the state's power shrinks and the individual's freedom grows.
And he saw this as the inevitable future. We were all moving from the militant past to the industrial future.
Yes, that was the direction of progress. But he got very worried toward the end of his life. He saw Britain sliding backwards. He called it rebarbarization.
What was causing this rebarbarization?
Imperialism. The massive expansion of the British Empire, the growth of the military, the rise of the bureaucracy needed to manage it all. He saw this as a sign that the militant type of society was making a terrifying comeback.
This leads us directly to his politics and the book that I think every libertarian has on their shelf, The Man versus the State, which he published in 1884.
This is his great political manifesto. By the 1880s, the Liberal Party in Britain, which Spencer used to identify with, started shifting. They began passing laws to help the poor, improve working conditions, fund public libraries, create safety regulations.
This was the birth of modern social liberalism.
It was. And Spencer was absolutely horrified. He saw it as a betrayal of what liberalism was supposed to mean, which to him was individual liberty.
He argued for what he called the right to ignore the state. That is a pretty radical concept, even today.
It is essentially anarcho-capitalism before the term existed. He believed that if the state provides anything beyond the most basic protection of life and contract enforcement, it is violating your fundamental rights.
The night watchman's state.
The absolute bare minimum. He believed that as society continued to evolve into the peaceful, industrial form, the state would eventually wither away and die completely. We wouldn't need police or courts because we would all be so perfectly adapted and moral that we wouldn't hurt each other.
A kind of biological utopia.
Exactly. But until that utopia arrives, he had some very, very harsh words for the government's attempts to help people along the way.
Which brings us to the famous quote, "All socialism is slavery."
And he meant that literally, definitionally. He laid out his logic like this. What is a slave? A slave is someone who labors under coercion to satisfy another person's desires.
Okay.
He then says, If the government taxes 10% of your income to build a public library that you don't want or use, then for 10% of your working hours, you are laboring under coercion for someone else's benefit. Therefore, you are 10% slave.
That's a powerful rhetorical argument.
It is. And he said it doesn't matter if the master is a single plantation owner or a Democratic committee voting to spend your money. The relationship of coercion is the same.
You can see why that resonates with people who value individual liberty above all else. But we have to look at the flip side of this. When you strip away the state's protection, what happens to the vulnerable? This brings us to what we call the dark side of Spencer, the social Darwinism.
Right. We have to address the extermination quotes. They're undeniably there in the text, especially in his earlier, more radical book, Social Statics.
He talks about the purifying process of nature.
He does. He says that the forces working toward ultimate happiness exterminate such sections of mankind as stand in their way.
Exterminate. That is a chilling word to use for human beings.
It is. He writes, "Be he human or be he brute, the hindrance must be got rid of." Now, Spencer's defenders, and he did have them, would argue that he is simply describing a law of nature, like describing how gravity works.
So he's not saying we should go out and exterminate them. He's saying nature will exterminate them if they can't adapt.
That's the argument. He's saying if you are not smart enough or strong enough or disciplined enough to survive in your environment, nature will kill you. And he believed that this death was, in a grand cosmic sense, benevolent because it weeded out the unfit and ensured the overall health of the species.
It's the cold logic of the herd. You let the slow gazelle get eaten by the lion so the herd as a whole stays fast.
Yes.
But applied to human beings, it means letting the widow and the orphan and the disabled person starve.
Well, this is where a really important nuance comes in, and one that often gets lost in the conversation about him. Spencer was not against charity.
Oh, so what was he against?
He was against state charity, compulsory charity.
What's the difference to him? From the perspective of the starving person, they get fed either way.
To Spencer, the mechanism mattered more than anything. If the state takes your money by force and gives it to the poor, there is no virtue in it for you. You were coerced. But if you choose to help a poor person out of your own compassion, that is an exercise in altruism. It improves your character.
So he's thinking about the soul of the giver, not just the stomach of the receiver.
Precisely. He actually encouraged private philanthropy. But, and it's a very big but, he warned that even private charity had to be administered carefully.
How so?
He said you shouldn't help the undeserving poor.
The undeserving poor. Who gets to decide who is deserving?
Well, in his view, the undeserving were the drunks, the lazy, the immoral. You should only give charity to those who are struggling due to bad luck, an accident, a sudden illness, not due to bad character.
Why?
Because if you help the lazy survive and reproduce, they will have lazy children, and you will be actively filling the world with lazy people. You'd be rewarding unfitness.
Again, it all comes back to that Lamarckian fear of breeding bad traits into the population.
Every single time.
And this obsession with good and bad traits extended to race as well. We have to talk about his advice to the government of Japan.
This is a fascinating and pretty disturbing historical footnote. In the late 19th century, Japan was rapidly modernizing and opening up to the West. And they respected Spencer immensely. They saw him as a prophet of the industrial society they wanted to become.
So they asked for his advice.
They did. They wrote to him and asked for his guidance on modernization. And he wrote a letter back, advising them in the strongest possible terms against allowing intermarriage between Japanese people and Westerners.
Why? What was his reasoning?
He called it creating a bad hybrid.
A bad hybrid.
Yes. He used biological analogies. He said if you mix two different species of animal that are perfectly adapted to their different environments, you get a hybrid that is adapted to neither. It's an inferior product. He applied this directly to human races.
So he thought that a child of a European and an Asian parent would have a chaotic constitution.
That's the phrase he used. It was a pseudoscientific racism. It wasn't necessarily based on hate in the emotional sense we think of today. He didn't seem to hate Japanese people. He respected them enough to advise them.
Right.
But it was based on this rigid and completely incorrect biological theory that races were like distinct species that shouldn't be mixed.
And he used the same logic to oppose Chinese immigration to America.
Correct. He visited America and was horrified by the idea. He thought it would cause social disorganization because you were mixing two profoundly different social types. He saw societies as these delicate organisms with their own specific internal balance. You can't just transplant tissue from one to another without rejection.
So if we stop the story right here, Spencer sounds like the ultimate villain for the modern progressive. He's against welfare, he's against immigration, he's talking about exterminating the weak. It sounds like a proto-fascist ideology.
That's certainly how he's often painted.
But, and this is the twist that makes him so complex and so fascinating, he was also a radical anti-imperialist who hated war.
This is the paradox that confuses everyone. It completely breaks the stereotype.
Right. If you believe in survival of the fittest, shouldn't you be cheering for the British Empire as it conquers the globe? Shouldn't you think, we are the strong, they're the weak, we win, this is progress?
That would be the logical conclusion. But Spencer hated it. He was arguably the most prominent and vocal anti-imperialist in Britain at the time. He detested the wars, the conquests, all of it.
Why? How does he possibly square that circle?
It goes right back to the militant versus industrial distinction. He believed that by conquering other nations, Britain was becoming a militant society again. To run an empire, what do you need? You need a big army. You need high taxes to pay for it. You need a powerful, centralized bureaucracy. You need a culture of obedience and deference to authority.
All the hallmarks of the militancy.
All the hallmarks. And all those things destroy individual liberty at home. They crush the voluntary, contractual society he valued.
So he didn't oppose empire because he felt bad for the people being conquered, though maybe he did on some level. He opposed it because he thought it was corrupting the British soul.
Precisely. He thought it was re-barbarizing Britain and dragging it back down the evolutionary ladder.
There's a really scathing quote I saw regarding the Second Afghan War. When he was told that British troops were in danger, he said something just shocking.
Oh, I know the one. He basically said, I don't care if they are shot.
Which is, wow.
Yeah.
Support the troops was not his motto.
Not even a little bit. And his logic was cold, but consistent, he said. When men hire themselves out to shoot other men to order, asking nothing about the justice of their cause, they are forfeiting their right to sympathy.
He viewed soldiers not as heroes, but as tools of a coercive state.
Exactly. Just another arm of the government he hated. He thought patriotism was just a fancy word for primitive tribalism, and that it was holding back human progress.
That is a level of ideological consistency that you almost have to admire, even if it's incredibly harsh. He hated the state so much that he wouldn't even support its wars when his own soldiers were dying.
This position really isolated him, didn't it?
Completely. By the end of his life, he was a man without a party. The conservatives hated him because he was anti-war and anti-empire. The liberals hated him because he was anti-welfare and anti-union. He was just this lonely, cranky old man shouting into the void.
And that brings us to the Great Decline. We started by saying he was the Aristotle of the 19th century. But by 1937, the great American sociologist Talcott Parsons opens a foundational book with the now famous question, who now reads Spencer?
And the answer was, nobody.
Pretty much nobody. It was a brutal and stunningly fast crash. And it happened for two main reasons.
Okay, what were they?
First, the science he built his entire system on fell apart.
Lamarckism.
Lamarckism.
Oh.
Around the turn of the century, the work of August Weismann and others on genetics established what's called the Weismann barrier. This proved that the reproductive cells, the sperm and eggs, are separate and insulated from the body cells.
So no matter how much you stretch your neck or go to the gym, your sperm or eggs don't change.
Exactly. Acquired characteristics are not inherited. And with that discovery, Spencer's entire promise of inevitable perfection just died.
If we don't inherit acquired moral traits, then there is no guarantee that humanity is getting better and better with each generation.
Right. We might just be stuck with the same flawed human nature forever. The whole teleological engine of his system ran out of fuel.
Okay, so that's the scientific reason. What was the second reason for his decline?
The world changed in ways he never predicted. Spencer's philosophy predicted a future of increasing peace, shrinking governments, and voluntary cooperation. Instead, the 20th century gave us World War I, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, Nazism, and communism.
The exact opposite of what he predicted.
The polar opposite. The militant societies didn't vanish. They came back with a vengeance and on an industrial scale. It became impossible to read Spencer's optimistic law of evolution with a straight face while looking at the trenches of the Somme or the gas chambers of Auschwitz.
He just looked hopelessly naive.
Hopelessly naive. And at the same time, the field he helped create, sociology, moved on. Sociologists like Emil Durkheim and Max Weber came along and said, look, society isn't a simple biological organism. It's a complex structure of culture, meaning, values, and symbols. They professionalized the field.
And Spencer was left looking like a gifted amateur.
He was. The historian Richard Hofstadter delivered the final, brutal blow when he called Spencer the metaphysician of the homemade intellectual.
Metaphysician of the homemade intellectual. Ouch. That is a devastating critique.
It's just brutal.
It basically says, this is philosophy for guys who like to tinker in their garages, not for serious thinkers.
It's an elitist dismissal, for sure, coming from a university academic, but it stuck. Spencer was cast out of the canon.
But he hasn't disappeared completely. We mentioned at the start that he is the ghost in the machine of modern libertarianism.
He is. His ideas had a long afterlife. The philosopher Robert Nozick, in his hugely influential book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, took Spencer's right to ignore the state very, very seriously.
And what about his influence more broadly in politics?
Think about the Margaret Thatcher era in the UK or the Reagan era in the US. That famous slogan Thatcher used, "There is no alternative," or TINA.
Right, no alternative to the free market.
That idea that the market is not just one possible system, but the only natural way to organize society, and that any attempt to interfere with it will only make things worse. That is pure, distilled Herbert Spencer. Every time you hear someone argue that taxation is theft or that government regulation is always counterproductive, you are hearing an echo of Herbert Spencer.
It is truly amazing how he can be the source of the paperclip and the source of modern anti-state rhetoric.
He was a system builder, a flawed one, a misguided one in many ways, but a powerful one. And parts of his system are still very much with us, even if people don't know his name.
So we've unpackaged the man, the myth, the paperclip, and the philosophy. We have looked at the synthetic philosophy that tried to explain the stars and the slums with the very same law.
We've seen the paradox of the pacifist who sounded like a brute and the hypochondriac who preached a gospel of strength.
And we've seen how fame is fleeting. Being the biggest intellectual of your century guarantees you absolutely nothing in the next.
A cautionary tale for all of us.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to chew on. We often think of survival of the fittest as a call for ruthless dominance, the strong crushing the weak. That's the social Darwinist nightmare that we rightly associate with the worst ideologies of the 20th century.
Right. That's the common interpretation.
But remember Spencer's goal, his teleology. He believed evolution was moving us toward a state of perfect altruism. He genuinely believed that eventually human nature would change so much that the very idea of causing another person pain would be physically impossible for us.
He thought we would become so empathetic that we would literally feel each other's feelings, making violence unthinkable.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? He advocated for what sounds like ruthless competition in the present in order to create a utopia of perfect saints in the future.
The ends justify the means on a cosmic scale.
So it raises a provocative question. Is it possible that we have completely misunderstood the goal of his philosophy? Was this brutal competitive process supposed to be the fire that burned away all our aggression, leaving behind a species that was purely kind? It's a strange, almost utopian thought from such a cold-seeming man.
It suggests that the fittest wouldn't mean the strongest or the most brutal. The fittest would eventually mean the most empathetic.
The kindest.
The kindest. And that is a definition of fitness I think we could all get behind, even if we completely reject the brutal biology he used to get there.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the rise and very steep fall of Herbert Spencer. We'll catch you on the next one.